Could you just repeat that very interesting invitation for reflection? Or maybe I can say to you what I think I heard in some way. So you're saying if we're struggling against some form of oppression and we manage to gain agency or gain some power, then we sometimes move into a position of exhibiting some of the characteristics of the oppression we were struggling against towards others. Is that what you said?
That's one way of taking what I said. I mean, I don't even remember what words I used there, Jane. So that what you said sounds right. It resonates with what I was saying. Is what's that? How, when we become empowered, how can we become empowered in a way that does empower others rather than disempower them? And the image I have of that is when we shine our light. How do we shine our light in a way that illuminates others rather than puts them in the shade? Yeah, so how can we really blossom and take the space and be, you know, willing to step forward? Because we're trained to not. We're trained to keep ourselves quiet, I would suggest, apart from particular men in particular context. Oh, no, anyway, leave that aside. Some people are allowed to speak, but the rest aren't. So how do we speak? How do we regain our voice and our heart? So for those men, how do they regain their heart and speak from their hearts? But in a way that enables other people to do that rather than takes the power and the space.
I would like to add something to what Jane said. I think another way that I have seen in several times is a co-option from the outside. So it's not only us, which is really important, us who are trying to make change of any type, not perpetuating what we're trying to change by not looking at it, but also like with things like, say, mindfulness. I have the sense that a lot of the goodness that is around mindfulness has been co-opted by some of the things that mindfulness may have tried to change, and you can see that's in the greenwashing that is happening, and the corporations just kind of hopping onto something that is really powerful, and then that losing its power in some way or becoming a minion, so to speak, of the thing that we are trying to change as well. And I think that's also part of what the Cree stories are about.
That's great, thank you. Okay, everybody's put on the spot, expecting to be listening to a talk rather than being asked to talk. But maybe this is the reverse of what we're, you know. Yeah, I can see that. But that's maybe the reverse of what we're, you know. This is okay. If you're put on the spot now, you've got time to speak. We're not listening to somebody. Here you are. There's a kind of challenge in it, isn't there? It's quite challenging rather than just empowerment. It has a challenge to it. Kate, you look like you're about to speak.
Yeah, just what Dita was saying, that was really one of the things I took away from the first session today, was how we need to engage with power in municipal level or wherever else. But you so easily finish up in conversation with European Commission or with donors or with the powers that be, and their way of framing and working and setting targets, what good looks like, all of those kinds of expressions that they're very comfortable with using. There's value in us knowing how to use them as well, but at some point there is a sense of crossing a line, and part of what I feel I'm working on is knowing somehow where those boundaries are, not in order to other the other one and kind of go, oh, you're no longer one of my set, but in order to be able to communicate and to enable the ripples that we are making to ripple out further, and to create the space for people to use the positions and the power that they've got to do something exciting and different with it, rather than just be part of what is, as opposed to part of what could be.
Great.
Another thing that I would want to add is, so in yesterday's session, the afternoon one for me here in Singapore, we briefly learned about Mendha Leka, which is this community in India that has managed to, move to a complete consensus model. And I did my undergraduate thesis on them, as I shared yesterday. Another way of interpreting co-optation, maybe not the theme of this session, but something that we can think about, is how does the empowered community sort of maybe not co-opt, but appropriate, and that is what my question was just in the other day on the first day, how they can actually change their negotiating position by sort of figuring out how to play the system or how to use the system's terminologies to further their own quests of, you know, self-sufficiency and autonomy and justice. So I feel like it goes back to the question of healing and groundedness. If communities, you know, if there are efforts to heal and ground communities and to make emerge in that collective identity, then the forces of cooptation, which are going to be present nevertheless, as long as we stay embedded within these, you know, nation state societies, are more likely to be sort of, I don't want to say like turned in our favor, but that's sort of a blunt way of putting it. That's sort of one of my learnings from the process I underwent for a year. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you, Shik. And I hope you get a chance to ask that question later of Colin. Mama, do you want to raise your point, which I think is really important?
Yeah, it's very interesting, I find, how we relate to change, as if somehow we can commandeer it, as if it's not something that has its own autonomy, that is taking place regardless of our relationship to it. And the way we acknowledge it's constant, it's going on, whether we like it or not. And so when we talk about like people occupying the position of change makers or leading change, or, you know, this languaging that we have around change, which tries to exert control, yeah. And it's impossible. You cannot control the change. You can flow with it and dance with it and do all kinds of things, but control it is not one of the things we can do. And so the impacts that happens in the attempt to control, I think, is part of what helps to produce the trauma. Yeah, because there is this, I don't know, some kind of abnormality happening here because you're trying to control something that is uncontrollable. And then how it is experienced within the body, within the psyche, collectively or individually, then produces a kind of trauma. So there is something like in the saying that the African heritage saying that I pasted earlier on about, you cannot shine a torch, you cannot hold a torch to brighten somebody else's path without also illuminating your own path. And so, you know, acknowledging that kind of collective nature, you know, the dance with the other aspects of nature which are in this room, because we too are nature. I mean, I was preaching to the converted, I'm sure, right? We all know these things. But it's like being very intentional and instrumental and always reinserting this knowledge in the midst of, you know, our ego taking over. Sorry, I'm going on.
No, that's lovely.
On. So
no, that's really lovely. Thank you. I'm just wondering whether Tanya and Eva, looks like you have something to say, and then maybe Katela, we can come to you after that, because you have arrived, which is great. We're still waiting on Colin, but Eva, I think you're first, and then Tanya.
Thank you. Yes, and some of the edge of what I was saying is kind of worn off because I've not got a very good brain at the moment. But it was about, I think it was in response to Kate's point around, you know, meeting the kind of culture of the mainstream power, you know, even well-intentioned, and then kind of getting sucked into their way of doing things, which I've seen happening over and over and again with community level projects. And I think something that we've been talking about in the river is this this idea of culture as in fermentation culture, building, creating, growing, sharing, evolving our cultures really consciously together, which is something that, you know, transition and the municipalists, and, you know, there's all kinds of people who are doing that. But I think it's really quite a strong focus for us, certainly in this gathering. It's like really digging into what is our shared culture, and then being able to bring that into relationship with people who don't share that culture, so that we're standing on something that's strong rather than standing on something that's wobbly and getting pushed over by people who have got a very strong and rigid culture. And I felt it a little bit this morning in the municipalist session. It's really lovely.
Thank you, Tanya.
Hi, everyone. The use of language and how our struggles are co-opted by mainstream language and mainstream culture. I don't want to say only power. And the example of Mexico came immediately to mind, how a lot of us voted for this person who seemed to be wanting the indigenous communities to participate, wanting to flatten the economy a little bit, flatten in terms of not making it as vertical, distributing power, whatnot. And his entire presidency for the last 2 years has been very similar to that of Trump, where all he does is use the language that took years to put on the table in Mexico, of equality, of participation, of democracy, the end of corruption, blah, 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 and use it to build a wall amongst groups. So now Mexico is this polarized place. It always has been, but it was in a way that was kind of embedded in the culture, which is not to say that it was good, but it wasn't ever used against each other. I guess that's why, in many ways, Mexico had been able to stay away from civil uprising at a wider scale. But now it's the way he uses the language that many of us throughout the years have tried to use to advocate for justice is now being used by the government to create difference and to really rupture and dismantle every single social structure in the country. And I wonder how, when we use similar language to refer to others, we are only buying into that and just fueling these forms that now governments have to use our own language against us.
Yeah, that's huge. And for me, that kind of touched into the climate movement too, and governments all making great claims, taking action on it, and then they use the claim to push for the need to take action on the climate in order to then be able to dispossess people of their lands and all sorts of things. So there's a real direct relationship there. And Catello, I was just wondering whether you wanted to speak to that a bit, around the kind of the ways in which cooptation of people's lands is happening in Kenya and elsewhere,